The events leading up to World War I are complex, and the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 in Sarajevo was a tipping point, rather than a cause for the First World War. What was originally described as skirmishes in the savage Balkan states eventually led to a war in which 135 countries took part and more than 15 million people died. Here we are in Tidworth, right in the middle of Salisbury Plain, and it's here that our story starts. In this film, we're going to try and give you a sense of what life was like for soldiers during the first week of British involvement in World War I. We're going to be following a group of soldiers that were actually based here at Tidworth, the 1st Wiltshires. We are also going to be following some groups of scouts from Wiltshire, Buckinghamshire and Belgium as they retrace the steps of the 1st Wiltshires and the Oxford and Bucks Light Infantry across Belgium and France.
A passion for Wiltshire life. BBC Wiltshire.
A group of scouts from Chippenham are preparing to follow in the footsteps of First World War soldiers from Wiltshire. The teenagers will be retracing the route taken by the Wiltshire Regiment when it was deployed 100 years ago this month. They'll also be taking part in a commemorative service to mark the centenary of the Battle of Mons at the weekend.
The scouts' objectives were to reenact the retreat from Mons to Le Cateau and to represent the UK at several international commemorations. They also raised money for the British Legion and UNICEF, charities that support those affected by past and present conflicts. The 1st Wiltshires were part of the 7th Brigade of the British Expeditionary Force, and it was here at Tidworth that they mobilised on the 4th of August 1914 when war was declared. From here they took a train to Southampton, a steamship from Southampton to France, and a train across France to Belgium. The movement of the British Expeditionary Force was conducted with such secrecy and efficiency that for several days the move remained unknown to the enemy. The Scouts engaged in some serious research about the first week of British engagement in the war and got help from the specialists at the Wardrobe Museum in Salisbury.
What we're going to try and do today is to try to bring the battalion alive, because it consists of people. Okay, you read books, facts and figures and all the rest of it, and it goes over people's heads. We're talking about people, not a lot older than yourselves in some respects. This photograph here, again, is we believe to be the last photograph taken of them in a ceremonial uniform marching in or out of Tidworth in 1914. They marched past a thing called the Wiltshire Poacher.
Martin gave the Scouts a powerful example of the terrible mortality rates for the Wiltshire soldiers.
These are the officers at Jelibad Barracks. The front row, not the place to sit really. On the left, Captain Fisher, killed in action 16. Captain Stoddard, killed in action 14. Major Roach, killed in action 14. The Colonel Halstead, wounded. Captain Rowan, wounded, 14. He later died in an aircraft crash in 1936. Captain Formby, killed in action 14. And the far right, Captain Dawes, killed in action 14, the first officer to get killed. Would you want to be sitting in that group? They didn't know what was coming, no more than the other lads did.
Captain Walter Dawes from Salisbury was the first officer of the Wiltshires to be killed in the war. He died at Sipley, near Mons, and later the Scouts would begin their walk from this very place.
The whole of the embarkation and mobilisation was very, very well rehearsed. The staff had practised, they knew a European war was coming, and they've been planning the movement of the British Expeditionary Force to France or to Europe since 1906. The actual planning for the movement was taken to such a degree that staff officers went to France to look at the respective heights of the platforms on the railway stations. In England, they were higher than in France, so there would have been so they tried to work out how to get the horses and the wagons off of the trains onto the platform without actually damaging them.
The experts from the Wardrobe Museum told the Scouts about the mad minute, the expectation that every rifleman should hit his target at least 15 times within a minute.
This is the weapon of choice used by the British Expeditionary Force, and they used it very well. The comment down the bottom there is 15 well-aimed rounds a minute. The soldiers referred to it as the mad minute.
Bang! 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 Must be 15. Right.
On the 22nd of August 2014, the Scouts arrived at the chateau of Monsieur de Witt at Gusseney, where they camped for 2 nights. The chateau is on the route taken by the 1st Wiltshires on their retreat from Mons. It was under German occupation during World War I.
It is a great honor for us in France, in Belgium, to receive the young people.
Monsieur de Witt emphasised the significance of the Scouts' visit and of the importance of peace. The Scouts were photographed with Monsieur de Witt and his 100-year-old flags, which were used in the 1918 liberation.
So did they do research before they came here?
Yeah, they researched several soldiers before they came here, one of which was John Davis, and he was one of the casualties from the Wiltshire Regiment.
I researched 4 members from the Wiltshire Regiment, who were all in devices in Salisbury and Chippenham, the area where I live. I researched this person called John Carpenter, who was one of the last to die, and in the same cemetery, Mons Communal Cemetery, John Davis was one of the first Wiltshires to die, and he was one of the last Wiltshires to die, so it's quite nice to research 2 significant figures in the Wiltshire Regiment.
What are your expectations of doing the long-term? What's your expected?
So I'll be very tired, but it would have been very fun and it would be worth it.
Do you know how long you're going to be walking for?
About 10 to 15 miles each day, and we're walking for about 4 days.
Okay. And it's retracing the route of the retreat from the Battle of Mons, is that right?
Yes, specifically the Wiltshire Regiment. So instead of going directly to Le Cateau, we're going to Cordray, which is where the Wiltshire Regiment was in the Battle of Le Cateau.
We are lucky to have some amazing war diaries written by soldiers who served during the first week of fighting, and we are going to draw on these diaries throughout the film to help tell our story. Alexander Johnston was the signals officer for the 7th Infantry Brigade, which included the Wiltshires.
August 22nd. Moved off at 6 a.m. and crossed the Belgian frontier during the morning. We eventually reached Sipley, just outside Mons, about 1 p.m. and went into billets. As usual, everyone is hospitality itself and gave us a very good lunch on arrival, while the men on the way were presented with eggs, bread, drinks, cigarettes, and even had their pockets filled with cigars. One can realise a bit more now that we are at war. The hatred of the Belgians against the Germans is intense. A German was found yesterday in one of the places we passed through today and was beaten to death.
On the 22nd of August, E Battery of the Royal Horse Artillery fired the first British artillery shot of the war. Today, 100 years later, the Scouts were invited to witness the same unit fire a commemorative shot to mark this event. E Battery are now based at Tidworth.
Number 4.
The same day, the cavalry were on reconnaissance north of Mons, and they encountered the Germans.
Our grandfather was the first officer, supposed to be the first officer that was killed in the First World War entirely. His name was Harold Martin Soames, a lieutenant in the 20th Hussars.
And how old was he?
He was 27.
He was a professional soldier?
Yes, he was a professional soldier, and he had been fairly recently married, and he had a daughter, our mother, who was just 17 days old, who he met just very briefly after the birth, and my mother, of course, never knew him. It was on, I think, his first day out here, first or second day out here. They were reconnoitring around a wood with about 10 soldiers on horses, and as they were on their way back to their camp, they were sniped from within the wood, and he was shot in the chest.
One of the first ever officer casualties was Lieutenant Soames of my grandfather's regiment, 20th Hussars. He was a regular soldier from Liverpool. His name was James Cody, and he was with a regiment called the 20th Hussars. And as you see by the photograph, he went into battle carrying a sword. He survived the whole war, came out in 1918. So he went through basically Waterloo-style fighting on horseback with swords. The tragedy with regard to his story, he joined the army, he was A1 fit. When he left in 1918, he was F3, so his health and fitness went.
We then went to the nearby village of Perron in Belgium. Belgium was occupied by the Germans during the 4 years of the war and suffered terribly during this time. A local historian showed us the bullet holes where the mayor of the town and his assistant had been executed against the wall. The invading Germans had incorrectly believed that they had been shot at by the Belgians. On the 23rd of August 1914, the British Army engaged in its first major action of World War I, the Battle of Mons. The first German army approached from the north and east after traversing Belgium. The British army approached from the south and west and spread themselves along the Mons-Condé Canal in an effort to try and defend it and to stop the Germans from entering Mons. During this battle, 8 German divisions fought against 4 British divisions. In this iconic photograph, soldiers are waiting to take position on the canal. This is the Mons-Condé Canal, where fighting began early on the morning of the 23rd of August 1914. And this is one of the 4 bridges that the British tried to defend with rifles, machine guns and artillery fire. But it didn't work out well for the British that day. German artillery, successful detonation of only one of the bridges, and general outnumbering meant that losses were heavy, and in the afternoon a retreat was ordered. Private Sidney Godley was in the Royal Fusiliers defending the rail bridge.
Well, eventually he was the last one. He held the bridge here with a machine gun for 2 hours while the 4th Battalion retreated.
And he was badly wounded in that?
He was 27 wounds to his back and bullet in his head.
Wow. And you got the Victoria Cross for that?
Yeah, he was one of the first 2. There was 2 awarded. That was the first 2 in the 1914 war.
Okay.
So, but then he spent 4 years as a prisoner of war.
Private Sidney Godley and his lieutenant M.J. Dease are remembered on this plaque under the bridge where they fought. The Scouts managed to track down the grave of Maurice Dease at the Saint-Symphorien Cemetery in Mons. They also found the grave of Private John Parr, the first British soldier to die in World War I. He was a reconnaissance cyclist. Nearby was the grave of Private George Ellison, the last British soldier to be killed in action in the First World War on the 11th of November 1918. He had also fought in the Battle of Mons 4 years earlier. Also at the cemetery were the Belgian Scouts.
Alors nous on est scouts ici à Mons, à 2 km d'ici, Et on a reçu une invitation des scouts anglais pour participer à un hike avec eux, et donc on a pris part à ce hike.
Et comment ça se passait jusqu'à maintenant?
Super bien.
It was a priority for the Scouts to find and to pay tribute to the grave of a Wiltshire soldier.
So this is the final resting place of Lance Corporal Green. Lance Corporal Green was from Salisbury, and he is the only casualty from the Wiltshire Regiment to be buried here.
We are retracing the retreat that the Wiltshire Regiment took from the start of the war from Mons, and that was after the Germans invaded, and they retreated because they were outnumbered and the Germans had a very big army.
I'm hoping to, see what they went through, also to enjoy it as well, I guess, with friends, and
learn a bit about it.
Yeah, learn what exactly happened.
Well, it's scary how many unknown soldiers there are, because it shows how bad war can be.
This week's about commemorating the start of the First World War and the opening campaign in the start of the war that the British fought in. And it's a great way for us to learn about the First World War. I had never known about this Battle of Mons before we've trained and we've looked at it, and we now know in depth what has happened, and it's great to know what is happening.
As well as the Belgians, the British Scouts teamed up with some German Scouts.
And have you all been hanging out a bit together?
Yes, yesterday we meet on the war path and hang out together since tomorrow.
Yeah, slept in the tent together yesterday.
Ah, right, okay.
Yes.
So you all
we are on a
camp.
camp. Yes. We change badges. Yeah, our badges.
Tomorrow is a big event.
Planting a tree.
Planting a tree with the Prime Minister.
Yes, I heard.
It was raining heavily when the Scouts arrived at the international commemoration of the Battle of Mons. This important ceremony was attended by the Belgian Prime Minister, the British and German ambassadors, and the Deputy Mayor of Mons. The Scouts played a central role in the ceremony, helping to plant a symbolic tree to commemorate those who died that day. Corentin Rausman, the archivist of Mons, was the main organiser of the centenary events.
Aujourd'hui, nous sommes tous rassemblés sur cette place pour se souvenir de tous ces hommes et toutes ces femmes qui se retrouvèrent dans l'engrenage de la Grande Guerre.
We also remember today individual acts of courage. 4 British soldiers received the Victoria Cross, the highest military award for courage in battle.
Je souhaite une très longue vie à cet arbre, qu'il soit garant de la mémoire de la bataille de Mons et le symbole de notre unité aujourd'hui.
Et je voudrais dire maintenant tout brièvement, aujourd'hui je peux dire, chers amis, et aujourd'hui nous sommes des amis, today we are friends, heute sind wir Freunde.
Scouts from each country helped their respective ambassadors to plant the tree. During the week, the Scouts were joined in various ceremonies by reenactors from the Great War Society.
All of the stuff you see here is what would have been packed into this, and the soldier would have gone into the field. Or the great coat.
So everyone would have carried one of them?
Every soldier would have been issued one of these, so in cold weather it could be used as an overcoat or a blanket at night. Cap comforter, mess tin, D-shaped mess tin, which was in use by the British Army for a long time. You'd have some rations made up of corned beef, water bottle, entrenching tool, which is this bit of equipment here. And in 1914 the idea was fast mobile warfare, so it would just be used to dig a scrape, which is basically the length of your body, probably so deep, just for you to lie in. The bayonet, the 1907 sword bayonet, which would attach to the rifle. 5 rounds, well 150 rounds in total. Knife, fork and spoon, pretty self-explanatory for your eating implements.
I represent a dispatch rider with the Royal Engineers Regiment in the signals section, so they were in charge of communications when I first prepare myself for the ride. Select low gear, set the throttle control, raise the valve lifter which decompresses the engine, and then I just paddle off, so I'll say goodbye.
After the Battle of Mons, the British began a great retreat towards Paris. The 1st Wiltshires marched 40 miles over the next 2 days from Sipley to Caudry, and it's this route that the Scouts will retrace.
Was woken up in the middle of the night and told that 2 companies of the 1st Wilts were in an isolated position with a large force of Germans close to them. Women and men carrying all their goods and chattels began to stream in from Mons, and then wounded men of the 9th Infantry Brigade who were holding the outskirts. All the bridges over the canal except one had been destroyed. Eventually the Germans got across by driving women and children over in front of them.
The Scouts prepared for the first stage of their walk, starting at Sipley.
Okay, so Sipley is where the Wiltshire Regiment were entrenched on the 23rd of August. It's where the Wiltshires took their first casualties. The first casualties were sustained just down the road. So the Wiltshires were held in reserve at the Battle of Mons, and their A, B and D companies were entrenched with the Worcesters on one side and Royal Irish Rifles on the other. They came under fire from the Germans around lunchtime when C Company had appeared. C Company had been in reserve and come up to sit behind the 3 trenches of the Wiltshires, and the Germans saw the movement, as I say, around lunchtime, opened fire, and the Wiltshires sustained something like 4 casualties, including 1 officer.
Captain Dawes and Lance Corporal Green were among the dead.
What we're going to do now is we're going to head off back to Goussainny, which is approximately 15 miles. It's what, 4:30, 4:45 now, so I'm guessing we're going to be back by sort of 10 o'clock if we're lucky.
The first stage of the long march would take the Scouts from Sipley just over the French border to their camp at Goussainny. Supporting the Scouts with the logistics on their march were members of the Bristol University Officer Training Corps.
So we're managing checkpoints along the route of their march and making sure their water bottles are full and give them a little bit of food, and then obviously feed them at the campsites.
August 24th, Sipley. The Germans began their attack soon after 4 a.m. When the German infantry advanced, our guns turned onto them and seemed to get the range just right, and I should say did a lot of damage. It was rather an awe-inspiring sight. Line after line of little grey figures coming over the open slopes towards us. They seemed endless. There was the roar of the guns, the noise of the shells overhead, and the shells bursting in the air just over the enemy's lines, but still they came on. It was soon obvious that we were up against a much larger force than ourselves and would have to retire, an extremely difficult thing to do as it was an awkward position to get out of. We started our march back to Bavai, some 13 miles distant. One got a slight idea of what a terrible thing defeat in war might be. Wounded men had to be left behind in Le Cateau at Sipley. Others were in ambulances, others bandaged up trying to march along. Men were scattered all over the place, very tired after a morning's long and anxious fighting, while the road was long, hard, dusty and hot.
The Scouts completed the first stage of their walk in the dark, and the next morning prepared for their second day on the road, from Gusseney to the walled town of Le Cateau.
How are you feeling this morning?
Bit tired, but yeah, ready to walk again.
And how did you find the march yesterday?
Well, my legs and feet really hurt at the end.
Yeah.
Yesterday was pretty tough. Yeah, it was stretched right into the night. We all worked together as a team though, so that made it a lot easier.
Was it really tiring?
It wasn't until right at the end when it got dark. Yeah, and we had some arguments along the way.
Oh, what were they about, do you think?
Well, someone scared someone with a frog.
I'm really impressed with them actually. They're doing really well. They're walking well. They're supporting the younger ones. Yeah, it's all really good, and they're doing really well with their research and finding war graves of people that they've looked up as well, which is good.
Would like to say a big thank you to Monsieur and Mrs. Madame DeWitt from Mons to Le Cateau. Thank you.
On leaving Gusseney, the Scouts divided into two, just as the British Expeditionary Force had done 100 years ago, to reduce the terrible traffic jam that had developed during the retreat from Mons. While the Chippenham Scouts marched southwest, the Aston Clinton Scouts went southeast, following the route of the Oxford and Bucks Light Infantry. The two forces passed either side of the Forest of Mormal. The international comrades left the chateau.
Sur le bord d'une poubelle, la cible monte à la poète sur le bord d'une poubelle. Une chaussette pleurée, une chaussette pleurée. Ne pleure pas chaussette, la cible monte à la poète, ne pleure pas chaussette.
The Scouts' rest point for the day was the German cemetery at Franois. As they arrived, a few Scouts discovered surprising reserves of energy.
Come on, Martin, run the last bit! Come on, Martin! Go on!
This is the cemetery at Franois. There are 4,500 German soldiers buried here, dating from 1914 and 1918. There was fighting here at the beginning of the war and at the end. For each of the crosses there are 2 soldiers buried, and there is also a memorial to 3,000 unknown German soldiers. 100 years on, in the same August heat, the Scouts followed the route described in 1914.
The road was packed. Cavalry with their horses, cavalrymen who had lost their horses, ambulance wagons, refugees, bicycles, perambulators, guns and infantrymen.
On their second night on the road, the Scouts camped at the fortified town of LeCateau. It too was on the route of the 1st Wiltshire's retreat.
How has your trip been so far?
It's been really fun. Lots of walking, so I got blisters, but it's been enjoyable. It's been with friends and it's been interesting. There have been lots of history along the way.
Comment tu peux décrire cette expérience que vous avez vécue?
Nouvelle et super. Ça m'a appris à parler anglais.
How has it been for you guys today?
It's not bad. It's been harder than yesterday because it's the second time doing it.
And so harder in what kind of way?
Just feet ache more.
A lot of what they learn at school is about the front lines, the casualties, the battles and things like that. Whilst that's very important and there's, hundreds of thousands of deaths, because it's important to remember what happened, but I think it's also much more important to understand it. And for children of that age to understand, like, you know, we've been at this twice in the last 100 years. We not do it a third time.
On the third and final day of this gruelling trek, the Scouts marched from Le Cateau to Caudry. In the morning, they listened to a war diary.
I felt a real and deep grievance against the fate that had brought me into such sorry straits. In addition to want of a rest, a great scarcity of drinking water and much else, want of food was at the root of our troubles. We'd been told to go as slow as we liked, provided the columns kept moving, and thus the afternoon found us still struggling along under a blazing sun, and the march developed into a disorganised crawl.
That morning, the Scouts were accompanied on their walk by soldiers from E Battery.
I'm Major Jim Allen. I'm the battery commander of E Battery, Royal Horse Artillery, which is part of 1st RHA. We're based in Tidworth. We've been there for a number of years now, and we're an AS90 regiment, part of the new reactive force. There's 95 men, and we hold 6 AS90 guns, which are 155mm howitzer artillery pieces. 3 of us went in before lunch, so those people stood around in this great big hall waiting to sit down. Said, right, the Mayor of the Prime Minister's coming in. Prime Minister's coming in? The Mayor of Mons is also the Prime Minister.
The combined team of Scouts and soldiers departed, and their rest point that day would be the small town of Solesmes.
Been tiring.
Yeah.
A lot of the kids yesterday had sore feet. We've had quite a few of them that we've had to chivvy along. Some of them have been running at the front. We've had 2 twisted ankles, and we've had a young man we've had to take to hospital due to a bit of larking around on one of the talks. I've been hot, sweaty, tired, hungry, thirsty, pretty much as it would have been 100 years ago.
A rather cold and misty morning, probably a good thing given the length of the march. A few of the men fell out along the way, complaining of sore feet, but most of the infantry kept going.
This is the road to Solesmes, down which the soldiers retreated, and it was here that the Germans were gaining ground. And the 1st Wilts and the 2nd South Lancs, who were covering the road, turned and single-handedly fought off the Germans, allowing the rest of the brigade to retreat. The action brought the Germans to a standstill.
Just after passing Romeries, the brigade got checked on the high ground above Solesmes, which is in a deep hollow with steep and narrow streets. The 1st Wilts then extended and took up a position, firing off every round of ammunition they had, though the Germans had got up close to them.
Here we are in the small village of Solesmes, which the Wiltshires reached on the evening of the 25th of August. The journey here was hot and dusty, but in the evening there was a heavy thunderstorm. And on top of that, there was a massive traffic jam up and down the high street of the town, where the roads are very steep and narrow. According to Max Hastings, the British, in those innocent days, lacked the ruthlessness necessary to clear the roads of fleeing civilians and vehicles.
The general then told me to go with him into town and try to get the guns through. The confusion in the town was appalling, the place being packed not only with our fellows but with civilians and the remnants of the French Territorial Regiment, and the traffic was continually being blocked.
The Scouts and E Battery arrived at Solesmes in the rain to pay their respect to the New Zealand soldiers buried at the cemetery.
The army, I think, have helped pick our pace up today. We're going a lot faster than we did yesterday, and now starting to feel it. Some of them are complaining that the feet hurt. You can see it in some of them. The attitudes have changed, and some of them are nearing their limit.
So how was it today, walking with the Scouts?
It was wonderful. Yeah. They're really engaging. I appreciated it very much. A lot of fun meeting them from where they're from. The different countries. So met some Belgians. They taught me some French. Listening to the kids really helps my linguistic skills, which are diabolical.
The Scouts bravely continued in the rain. Meanwhile, the Scout leaders prepared their tents at Caudry, right where the 1st Wiltshires were entrenched during the Battle of Le Cateau.
The Royal Horse Artillery have been absolutely brilliant with us. We left in about 6 o'clock, 5 kilometres away from here. There's been a bit of a mishap in between. Part of the group got separated. I think they're back on track now, they're back together.
Conditions deteriorated. It had been raining for several hours and the Scouts had been walking for 3 days. Chilled, completely soaked and tired, they pushed on and managed to find sufficient reserves of energy to reach their destination, the town of Caudry.
5 of us got detached from the main group at quite a tricky crossing place. We ended up wandering off down the wrong path, so we've had to navigate back down to here. We've actually achieved the objective of getting to Caudry. Now our youngsters, which are very cold, they're very tired and they're extremely wet. They need a hot drink and a shower, food and they need bed.
Me and JB, we sprinted at the end.
Oh,
we somehow found energy to sprint at the end.
Was it really wet?
Yeah, as you can tell.
How far did you walk, do you think, today?
16 miles. Minimum 15.
Yeah, and are you really soaked?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh dear. I bet you want to get inside pretty quick.
Yeah.
Have you had anything to eat yet?
Yeah, we had one, and that's it. I'll have an orange.
How's it going?
Good, yeah. It's very wet though.
And your hat looks pretty good for
Yeah, it's so good.
How was the last
Funnest.
The walk is over. Next morning, refreshed and dry, the Scouts got ready for a commemoration of the Battle of Le Cateau. This important battle took place 100 years ago to the day. As the British retreated, the German army were hot on their heels. The Germans were advancing so fast that part of the British army, including the 1st Wiltshires, had to stand and fight in order to cover the retreat for the rest of the army. In this battle, the Wiltshires were positioned at Caudry.
Chilled and soaked to the skin, the platoons assembled. When the troops marched into Caudry, they were somewhat astonished to see shops still lighted and people sitting at the little tables at the cafes.
Here we are in Caudry, where the 1st Wiltshires arrived at around midnight on the 25th of August, after nearly 46 hours of marching non-stop. They bedded down for the night, and their general, Horace Smith-Dorrien, called an emergency meeting to decide whether to continue the retreat or to stop and fight. And this is interesting in relation to what Smith-Dorrien is quoted as having said before the war, so let's hear from him directly. He said that war should be avoided at almost any cost. War will solve nothing. The whole of Europe and more besides will be reduced to ruin, and the loss of life will be so large that whole populations will be decimated. The cavalry officer, Allenby, said that although the troops were exhausted, they were willing to stand and fight. Smith-Dorrien made his decision around 3 a.m. And to quote his words exactly, he said, "Very well, gentlemen. We will fight."
The commander decided, after his soldiers were so exhausted, to make a stand in LeCateau, and during that day, I believe it was 7,812 soldiers, British soldiers, lost their lives. And from our perspective, and a gunner perspective, we lost 38 field guns, so it's a really big sacrifice.
Do you think that was the right thing to do, to stop and fight at that point?
I believe so, yeah. It was obviously a very difficult decision to make. Even the soldiers were clearly clearly exhausted, but they were being chased pretty successfully by the Germans. Somebody had to make that sacrifice. Le Cateau was sort of door-to-door fighting. It was urban combat. It must have been pretty ferocious, and a lot of the stuff was done in very close quarters with very tired soldiers. It's nothing for us to do this now, but it must have been very, very tough for those guys back then.
The troops were strung out along the road between Caudry and LeCateau, facing the oncoming Germans to the north. 60,000 troops took up positions across 10 miles of green and golden fields. One soldier thought that the place resembled Salisbury Plain without the trees. Here we are at Le Cateau, the site of the famous battle which happened on the 26th of August. This battle has been described as the last battle to be fought with 19th century tactics, but using 20th century weapons. The fighting began at 5 a.m. and continued until 5 p.m. At 2 o'clock, Brigadier McCracken was wounded and a slow retreat through the town began. There were 40,000 British soldiers fighting here, and over 8,000 were killed. The number of Germans that were killed here is unknown, but it's estimated to be over 15,000. Having reached their final destination at Caudry, the Scouts attended the commemoration ceremony of the Battle of Le Cateau. This was held on Suffolk Hill, named after the Suffolk Regiment who defended it during the battle. The Scouts played a prominent part in the ceremony.
Seigneur Jésus, tu as toujours ouvert tes bras aux plus petits comme aux plus grands, aux plus jeunes comme aux plus âgés, à ceux de ta race comme aux étrangers.
We thank you for the peace that we enjoy. We thank you for the futures that we have because of the sacrifice of a few.
I represent the soldiers and the officers of the battery, which is the direct descendant of 3-7 Battery Royal Field Artillery, the Royal Artillery, and all of the units of the British Army who fought with such honour and courage on Wednesday the 26th of August 1914.
Je représente les soldats et les officiers de la batterie, qui est la descendante directe de la 37e batterie d'artillerie de champ royal. L'artillerie royale et toutes les unités d'armée britanniques qui se sont battues avec honneur et courage le mercredi 26 août 1914.
For the 200 soldiers and officers of 3-7 Battery, it was only 10 days since they had left the safety of their barracks in Ireland. They travelled by sea to France, fought in the area of Mons, and with the remainder of the British Second Corps, stood and fought here with distinction against the German army.
Lance Corporal James Webb from Chippenham was reported missing in action at Le Cateau, and his wife appealed for any information. James Britton, another Chippenham soldier, wrote to tell her of the sad news.
I'm sorry to break the news that the poor chap got killed. He had a locket round his neck and had 2 photos in it. I knew him. He used to work in the foundry. The Germans very nearly surrounded us. As I was crawling along, I noticed he was hit in the head. I should have took the locket off, only I had no chance because the Germans were on top of us.
Back at Caudry, we found the exact spot where the first Wiltshires were entrenched. Right here, on this very site, next to this busy road on the outskirts of Caudry, is where the first Wiltshires fought in the Battle of Le Cateau. They were dug into shallow scrapes on the ground, and nearby were their comrades from the 7th Brigade. The 3rd Worcesters were to their north and the 2nd South Lancs to the west, and across the road was the German army advancing. I am standing in what would have been no man's land, between the German and the British lines. Over here, the German artillery opened fire on the Wiltshires, as one soldier wrote in his diary. With the first grey light of dawn came a sudden bark of field guns close at hand to the northwest. Shells hurtled overhead and burst over the houses.
Eventually it got so bad in the centre that I collected some men of about 5 different regiments and gathered them in the fields in front of the town. We lay out there in the turnips for a couple of hours and had a very hot time of it. There was artillery fire overhead. Mostly they were aiming for the houses behind us, so it was going over our heads, but then eventually they found the right range. There was constant rifle fire, and I felt a sharp blow above my heart. And later in the day I actually found the spent bullet in my left-hand breast pocket and the bullet hole in my coat.
To mark the end of their journey, the Scouts marched into Le Cateau in a ceremonial procession with the soldiers and the reenactors. The town of Le Cateau hosted a banquet for the participants of the ceremony.
How would you describe your experience?
It's been fun sometimes, but really tiring overall.
And what's been the best bit for you?
The best bit was going to the cemeteries and seeing all the different graves with the different people.
And what about the worst bits?
The walking and the rain.
And what do you feel like you've learned from this trip?
In England we always learn about the English soldiers, but over here you get to see all the different ones, including the German ones, so yeah.
I probably enjoy going to all the ceremonies and actually having a look. What's been interesting is the reenactment people, they look really good.
And what have you enjoyed least?
Probably the walking yesterday, because my feet actually got soaked and it was quite uncomfortable, so yeah, that's probably it.
And what have you learned from this trip?
Well, I've learnt what it must have been like to go through. Just to get the experience really was absolutely amazing.
Fun. The walk was very tiring, but it was fun as well.
And what's been your favourite moment so far?
Hanging out on the trip with the Belgian Scouts.
And why was that so good?
Because we spoke different languages and it was fun just talking to them.
Que c'était vraiment génial de rencontrer des gens d'un autre pays, d'une autre langue. En plus, on apprend l'anglais à l'école et le fait de pouvoir la parler avec des gens, ça nous aide aussi à apprendre un peu plus et puis on rigole toujours avec et c'est assez sympa.
What's been great about this trip is 3 groups of scouts, 3 troops mixing together.
Thank you. Thank you all. See you soon. À bientôt. Ouais, bon retour.
Il s'appelait Sue, c'était un cheval blanc. Il était mon idole, et moi j'avais 10 ans. Notre pauvre père, pour acheter ce pur sang, avait mis dans l'affaire jusqu'à son dernier franc.
It's been tiring, it's opened a lot of people's eyes. I think just being together with Belgian Scouts and briefly with German Scouts, it's just been everything that we set out to do. So I'm quite chuffed.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
C'était un cheval blanc, il était mon idole, et moi j'avais 10 ans. Notre pauvre père acheté ce pur sang, avait mis dans l'affaire jusqu'à son dernier franc.
It's been tiring, it's opened a lot of people's eyes. I think just being together with Belgian Scouts and briefly with German Scouts, it's just been everything that we set out to do. So I'm quite chuffed.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn.